Thank you very much. I'm assuming you can hear me because I can hear my own sound vibrate. This is really an August setting, and August colleagues. I know several of you, so I'm very delighted to see my friends and to many new people. Special thanks to Gretchen and to Gray for all the help, for the enticement. I really wanted to be here, but last year has been magical, to say the least. What I'm going to do, I thought, and forgive my presumption, but I thought that several of you may not know that this woman that I wrote about was our first woman ruler in India 350 years before our first democratically elected woman Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi. So I made a really small documentary on her, and I thought we might just play it for 4 minutes, and then I'll tell you what I'm going to do.
In the winter of 1577, when a large comet passed Earth, starting on a road outside Kandahar in Afghanistan, a girl was born to a couple leaving repressive Persia. They were headed to the land beyond the river Indus, Al-Hind, as the Persians and Arabs called it. The great Mughals ruled the vast northern region of this land, and the empire was, in the main, peaceful, economically prosperous, and culturally vibrant, a welcoming home to people of all faiths and leanings from far and wide. 34 years later, in 1611, the same year that Shakespeare premiered The Tempest, that little girl became the 20th and favorite wife of Jahangir, the fourth Mughal king. By this time, she was a widow and a mother of a girl. The emperor honored his wife with a new name, Nur Mahal, or Light of the Palace. Later, he would dignify her as Nur Jahan, Light of the World, the name by which she became famous. While other wives were secluded behind walls, Nur Jahan ruled the vast empire alongside her husband as co-sovereign. A master shot, she saved her subjects from killer tigers. An ingenious architect, she innovated the use of marble in the mausoleum of her parents on the banks of the Yamuna River in Agra that inspired her stepson's Taj Mahal. An astute politician and devoted partner, Noor led troops into battle to free Jahangir when he was imprisoned by one of his own officers. She signed and issued imperial orders, and coins of the kingdom bore her name. All these were convincing technical signs of sovereignty, recognized by the jurists, the court, and the men and women of India. At last, her authority reached such a pass, says a contemporary historian, that the king was such only in name. Repeatedly, he gave out that he bestowed the sovereignty on Nur Jahan Begum. Only a generation earlier, Jahangir's father, Akbar the Great, had ordered all royal women, wives, daughters, and concubines to be sequestered behind harem walls. He called them the veiled ones. But 3 decades after Akbar's dictate, Nur Jahan was on view in the most male and public of places. A Shia woman married to a Sunni king, Nur Jahan was a remarkable leader in a male-dominated world. She didn't come from royalty like Queen Elizabeth, Cleopatra, or other renowned women rulers, and yet she ascended from the emperor's harem to great heights as an astute politician and favorite wife of Jahangir. A new kind of power was on display. Nur Jahan was the only woman ruler in the long dynasty of India's great Mughals.
Okay, so it took us 2018 to bring the only woman ruler among the great Mughals of India, the builders of the Taj Mahal, onto the world stage. She's been loved, she's been beautifully received, but it's been quite a journey. And as a scholar speaking to scholars, I want to share something of that backstory. The narration seems like a flawless story. The narration seems as if all I had to do was to just sit down and write this book. But it took me 5 years of actual writing, 7 years altogether, and lots of chiding from my editor in New York. So I can speak more about that later on, but for now, let me just speak to you something about the technicality, but not really technicality. What does biography mean? What is the status of sources? Why is it always a challenge when it comes to writing about even great figures, the standard kind of claim and charge that there are no sources for it? So these are some of the backstories that I want to cover, and I'd be happy to talk as much as you want after that. I'll begin with late 1619. A ferocious rogue tiger had been prowling the outskirts of Mathura, on the edge of a dense forest not far from Agra, the capital of Mughal India. Mathura was a pilgrimage site sacred to the Hindu deities Krishna and his consort Radha. But the intercession of the gods seemed not to be forthcoming, and the tiger continued to attack pilgrims and villagers. Luckily, the fourth Mughal Emperor Jahangir and Empress Nur Jahan were due to pass through Mathura on their way to Kashmir in the foothills of the Himalayas. The cavalcade halted near Mathura. No sooner had servants begun erecting hundreds of magnificent tents with the harem quarters marked by intricately carved red screens than a group of local huntsmen appeared and begged the emperor to do something about the fierce tiger that had eluded them. Killing tigers was a royal prerogative. Unfortunately for the emperor, shooting a tiger was out of the question. Several years earlier, Jahangir had taken a vow to give up hunting when he turned 50, and thereafter injured no living being with his own hands. He was 2 months past that milestone birthday and had recently renewed the vow as an offering to the gods on behalf of one of his young grandsons, a little prince traveling with the royal party under the empress's care. This little boy suffered from infantile leprosy. The empress, however, was prepared to protect her subjects. The beautiful Nur Jahan, light of the world, a name bestowed by her husband, was the last and most beloved of the emperor's 20 wives and many more concubines. She was 34 when they wed, nearly middle-aged in their world, the daughter of a noble, as you've heard, who had fled Persia, the widow of a court official implicated in a plot against the emperor, and the mother of a girl from her first marriage. Since Jahangir and Nur's wedding in 1611, Nur Jahan had proved to be a loving wife, a wise and just queen, and a great shot. So on October 23rd, 1619, and Jahangir is recording this in his memoir, Nur Jahan mounted an elaborate howdah, the seat atop an elephant, holding a musket, and she made her way down the sandy track towards the forest, accompanied by her husband Jahangir and rows of courtiers, attendants, and hunters on a superbly ornamented elephant and horses, and in red and gold jeweled palanquins with silken and brocade seats carried by bearers and decorated by garlands of flowers. Portraits from the period suggest that Nur Jahan will have worn a regal turban, much like the ones that was favored by the emperor and his distinguished noblemen, but highly unusual for a woman. A jama, which was a knee-length tunic, and tight trousers with a sash around her waist, small ruby and diamond earrings, and a ruby, I'm not making this up, and a ruby and diamond studded necklace, shoes open at the back, exposing the henna designs on her feet. The hunting party passed through fields of barley, peas, cotton, and mulberry, lush from the recent rains. Down lanes along the way, they spotted herds of cattle, goats, and blackbuck, and long corkscrew hen. Nur Jahan and her party could barely see beyond the dense walls of creepers, bushes, and trees. Lofty Neem, Thorny Babu, and several others. The village hunters knew the rhythm of the forest and its animal life. They led the Empress and a troop to the spot where the tiger usually emerged. Nur's elephant in the forefront began groaning and stepping nervously from side to side. It had sensed the presence of the tiger. The mahout tending the animal couldn't make it stand still. Nur Jahan's palanquin swayed. Later, Jahangir would write about that moment in his memoirs, the Jahangirnama, a public record of his reign that he kept from the year since he ascended the throne in 1605. And this is what he wrote. An elephant is not at ease when it smells a tiger and is continually in movement, and to hit with a gun from a litter is a very difficult matter. So the tiger appeared from the trees. Nur lifted her musket, aimed between the animal's penetrating eyes, and pulled the trigger. One shot was enough. The beast fell to the ground, killed instantly. Nur's shooting skills were already legendary. A few years earlier, she had amazed courtiers by cornering 4 tigers and bagging all of them with only 6 shots. Until now, such a shooting was never heard or seen. That from the top of an elephant and inside that of an howdah, 6 shots should be made and not one miss, so that the 4 beasts found no opportunity to spring or move, Jahangir wrote in his memoir. To honor Nur Jahan's feat, he proudly scattered hundreds of coins at her feet. A court poet witness to another such scene 2 years earlier recited aloud, "Though Nur Jahan be in form a woman in the ranks of men, she's a tiger slayer." Haji Muhammad was a painter in Pakistan practicing in the 1960s. And after a very long gap, he revived the Mughal school of painting in the mid-20th century. He's called the father of Mughal miniature painting. These paintings that look that large are about this size. And so the word miniature. He is called the father of Mughal miniature painting in Pakistan. And as I said, he was a hereditary court painter from the Patiala family of Muslim painters in India. He would restore and recast Mughal art by beginning with a series of paintings on the splendid sovereignty of Nur Jahan. Among these, not surprisingly, the learned Sharif drew Mughal brave Queen Nur Jahan with her husband King Jahangir killing tiger with her spear. Now, as I've said, the hunt was a significant act of arbitration between the ruler and nature. A sovereign was in charge of such mediation, the royal hunt being the first line of defense against the encroachment of threatening nature. As with their Central Asian predecessors, Mughal hunting continued to symbolize imperial dominance over nature. The king showed his ability to tame the wild, identify and mobilize resources, demonstrate administrative and bureaucratic skills, and publicly assert his bravery in the open theater of the hunting grounds. But Nur Jahan was much more than a tiger slayer. She was something unprecedented in the Mughal Empire, a co-sovereign. A generation earlier, Jahangir's father, Akbar the Great, had sequestered, again, you heard this, queens and princesses behind the harem walls, declaring them the veiled ones. And 3 decades after his dictate, his daughter-in-law, the 20th wife of the 4th Mughal, was on view in the most male and public places. A new kind of power was on display. Nur Jahan, a late migrant to the Mughal court, did not marry Jahangir to give birth to imperial sons, as wives were expected to do. In fact, they had no children together. She already had a daughter and he 4 sons. Yet for more than a decade, between 1614 and 27, 15 years, she ruled Mughal India along with him, effectively and prominently. Now, the Mughals had a reputable history of strong women, which I've charted in my first book. Gretchen mentioned that. Authoritative dowagers, astute aunts, regularly consulted on sovereign and diplomatic matters, an elderly radical Princess Memorist, who I'm coming back to, who left for posterity the only woman's history. Very subversive account. For all that, women had not openly and fully taken charge of the empire. So Nur Jahan, the daughter of the most eminent courtier of Jahangir, she navigated the landscape of feudal courtly politics and the male-centered culture of the Mughal world to become the co-ruler of the empire. In her person, the privileges of a favorite wife, influential matriarch, and sovereign empress fused together. She was the axis upon which the inner world of the harem and the outer world of the grand court met. A novel and delicate arrangement appeared, an ever so slight shift. Now, the technical questions of what made a sovereign remained in place, certainly in the minds of the clergy, who puzzled over the empress's power. Noor's shooting skill wasn't the only thing that made her highly unusual. She held a position in the empire never before filled by a woman and never after, a co-sovereign. So for more than a decade and a half, from the few years after their wedding until the emperor's death in 1627, she ruled with him, successfully navigating, as I've said, this labyrinth of feudal courtly politics. She issued imperial orders, and coins of the realm bore her name, along with her husband. Now, in Islamic thought and practice, the edicts, that is imperial orders, and the coins are convincing and acceptable technical signs of sovereignty. Furthermore, and this is very interesting, this is actually a small button to be put in the turban, and this is held in Harvard. She sat where no other Mughal queen had sat before or would after. This is called the Jharokha, which is an imperial balcony projecting from the palace from which government business was conducted. Subjects gathered below the imperial balconies to pray for her health, and getting a look at her was considered auspicious. More important, nobles sometimes presented themselves below these balconies and listened to her dictates, according to a contemporary historian. And in the words of the same historian, at last her authority reached such a pass that the king was such only in name. Repeatedly he gave out that he bestowed the sovereignty on Nur Jahan Begum. The strength of Noor's position was such, predictably, that many began to speak of a feeble emperor and a powerful, manipulative de facto empress, haughty and stomachful in the view of Peter Mundy, a 17th century traveler, a person of uncommon political and cultural acumen and a remarkable leader of men in the view of many others. Now, she was the only woman ruler in the long dynasty of India's great Mughals. How did the empress's extraordinary strengths, the emperor's lamentable weaknesses, the twists and turns of 17th century politics, and the power of their love combine to defy a time and culture that ought to have made the reign of Nur Jahan impossible? And why is it that this phenomenal figure has been effectively expunged from Mughal histories? Why did it take, as I said, 2018 to launch her co-sovereignty and her magnificent power? And this is the story, something of that story I want to share with you. For generations, feminist scholars have been asked this question: how are you going to write such and such a history? There are no sources for it. As I embarked on research for a DPhil at Oxford, which became my first book, on her forerunners, a senior male colleague put that question to me. While writing my second book on the figure of the girl child in India, I was asked exactly the same question, even though my first book had come to be seen as especially important because I had interrupted the imagined fixity of the Mughal archive. And at the cost of being immodest, it was the first gendered history of the empire. Now, the question of archive, sources, evidence continues to bedevil us, even in exploring as public a figure as Nur Jahan, although now people have figured out a little bit more nuance. Best captured in the question of a distinguished scholar who said to me while he was talking to me about Nur Jahan, but doesn't Nur Jahan appear only in representation? And who doesn't? What is not representation? I asked him. So here's a charge. She did not write a memoir. Okay, of course, much can be said about the complexities of memory. But what about her imperial orders, her sublime poetry, her coins? She's the only woman in whose name Mughal coins were struck. A trendsetter, she commissioned several unprecedented gardens, caravanserais, and other buildings. The emperor himself broke from the established tradition of official histories, bringing her to life in quite unprecedented ways in his very personal and public memoir. Curious observers, starting in her own time and into the late 19th century, court visitors that included Thomas Roe, the ambassador of James I, to their court. Tradesmen, diplomats, court chroniclers wrote zealously about her. Painters produced her portraits. Nur Jahan appears even in those places where we might not expect to find her. All we have to do is to bother to look, and sometimes that entails looking around the heavy figures of men. So let me, this is a part, it's critical, but I'm going to just sum this up because I wanted to share the spirit of these sources. I just said that her husband wrote this amazing memoir, broke from the tradition of official history writing in which an official chronicler was established, right, but he decided to write himself. And so when I began reading the memoir, somebody said to me, you know, but there are not that many entries on Nur Jahan. So I said, well, if you look at the Persian record, we have over 36 entries, which are the largest ever of any woman in this entire history of 350 plus years. And then this person said to me, and this is where a very interesting journey began. She said, but he's all full of hunting. And so I began to think, my goodness, that's true. I mean, that's a really important question. So I began to talk to a lot of experts who had written on war and hunting. And the more I talked to them, the more I figured out that this was one of the most significant signs of exercise of sovereignty. And that's where the book begins, with this whole idea of sovereignty. Let me just give you one other. I mean, there's scores of books to go over, but let me give you two more examples. There's a man called Farid Bakri who was a witness to her splendor. And he wrote the first encyclopedic bibliographical work of all the aristocrats of the empire. It had 368 male nobles with one distinguished woman. Okay, the longest entry. All right, we know this. There's something to be thought about why there is one woman in the list of 368 men that are discussed. I'll give you one other last example. That image that you saw in which he's upon an elephant and goes hunting in order to save the emperor. It's the penultimate chapter in the book. He's captured by one of his noblemen, is in custody, and she goes to fight. She loses initially, but strategizes beautifully, saves him and saves the empire. This is a year before he dies. There's a very beautiful 100-page Masnavi, that is a Persian style of poetry in which the divine Rumi wrote, okay? So 100 pages of beautiful poetry writing on that moment. It's titled Fatnama-e-Nur Jahan Begum, literally the chronicle of the victory of Nur Jahan. It's held in Aligarh Muslim University in northern India. People know about this. I didn't dish it, but they say this is panegyric. So in the courtly world, what is not panegyric? Everybody is trying to please the emperor, right? The reason why I'm bringing these range of sources, okay, and then one last thing, of course, there's always so much to say on Nur Jahan. Before Nur Jahan, women were stylistically portrayed in the court. That is, if you can imagine women in these miniature paintings, they almost always looked the same. What distinguished them from each other is style of clothing, a little message by way of how authority is depicted. something or the other in art historical terms will help us understand who this particular person is, but they were not individuated. She was the first woman to be actually portrayed, and this is the time when Mughal art is at its epitome. Okay, so we have these amazing, and there's a couple of paintings I'm going to talk about at length. The reason why I'm mentioning all this is to say sources is not a huge, humongous category, right? There are distinctive texts. We have to understand the iconography of those texts. I literally went back to graduate school to understand art. I mean, the way historians use Mughal art is, it's to be inserted, it's aesthetic, it complements that particular time in a written manuscript. But if you talk to art historians, as I was very lucky, many Mughal art historians who I'm indebted to, and architecture historians, it's really learning the iconography. So it's really not just about representation. There is a whole history behind each of these texts, and the point I'm trying to make is that these provocative and extensive sources require careful reading. They present the challenge of distinct visual and literary languages. But more than anything else, they require what a great critic has called a coercive rearrangement of desire. That, we don't know the story. That a woman could aim so perfectly as Nur Jahan and shoot so accurately had confounded several courtiers, court poets, and the emperor himself. A colleague of mine, an expert in Islamic studies, a scholar in my department, was astonished when I mentioned to him about Noor's hunting. She hunted? You mean she hunted? And it is recorded? What more do you need? He said to me. That is, I should wait for any more evidence. Another historian, an Ottomanist who I met at a conference in Zurich, was stunned that Nur Jahan had issued imperial orders under her own signature. He couldn't get over his surprise and wanted the details of each of these. The range is no different from that of the Padshah, king, he noted. So our inherited privileges and prejudices, which includes class, social and cultural capital, education, have conditioned and restricted our imagination, not to say the ways in which we should know or be. What we need is an interruption of the certainty of these privileged ways of seeing, apprehending, and believing. For unusual figures in histories, even when the evidence is before us, a common visceral reaction is disbelief. Such a position, I'm suggesting, is arrogant and paradoxical. Our writing, our living with the figures that we carry to our teaching in the humanities must have a way to expand the imagination without replacing it with something already known. And yet, this is the demanding, slow work with uncertain outcomes, work that I think requires looking where we don't habitually look. Or as Adrienne Rich said almost 4 decades ago in the context of probing how to speak about feminine cultures, and I'm going to read from her, to question everything, to remember what it has been forbidden even to mention, to look afresh at, and then to describe for ourselves the frescoes of the Ice Age, the nudes of the high art, the Minoan seals and figures, the moon landscape embossed with booted print of a male foot. To do this kind of work takes a capacity for constant active presence, a naturalist attention to minute phenomena, for reading between the lines, watching closely for symbolic arrangements, decoding difficult and complex messages left to us by women of the past. And with that, then let me turn to the new mode I decided to take, which is to go into public scholarship, to write a narrative history, and to write a biography. I mean, I've done academic books. So what did I think about biography? What was I writing while I was struggling with all these questions that I've suggested here? My sense was that certainty marks biography, or certainty marks the way biography is imagined. So life chronology inevitably hastening from ancestry and birth, concluding with the last years in the end, kill your subject. In such an architecture, the evidence for biography must be straightforward, and hence this whole charge about, well, she did not write memoirs, letters, exchanges, preferably directly from the hand of the subject, and very close to the time in which she lived. All this should have made the biography of Nur Jahan absolutely impossible. There is no memoir, no letters, nothing that would satisfy the traditional paradigm. In fact, she couldn't fit the traditional paradigm. Not from the royal Mughal family, married before, mother of a girl, she comes to the harem after her husband was hacked to pieces, first husband. Marries the emperor at 34. I won't tell you the whole story. It's a very juicy story and you should read it. Marries the emperor at 34. They never have children. Instead, she rises stupendously as co-sovereign. So like biography, the grounds of history are supposed to be flawless. Okay, historian speaking. History, it is imagined, requires distance, trusting only the official state-sponsored record. Biography and history are, in fact, closely related, but it's not always an easy relationship. It is this relationship that I agitated over in writing Empress. History, biography, evidence, everything was in question mark. And legends. I mean, how to think about this figure who happens to be a household name in South Asia, soaked in public imagination. Particularly that pigeon story that has scores of variations on the theme of the young prince losing his heart to a cute and agile heroine, the love story of Nur Jahan and when she had met the emperor in their youth, first found in the 19th century. So both in Pakistan and India, the people I talked to invoke two dates: Nur's birth in 1577 outside the road, so there's a drama to it, which is actually factually true, and marriage in 1611, and explain their importance in a few lines. Everybody, more than 30 interviews. She was born on the road outside Kandahar in modern-day Afghanistan, as her destitute parents made their way from Iran to India. They abandoned her, then she was restored to them. Jahangir and Nur Jahan met in the Meena Bazaar. He fell in love with her, they married. End of story. So, though modern South Asians embrace these legends of Nur with affection and gusto and pride, the emphasis on her romance with Jahangir truncated her biography. There were 10 films made on her, each called Nur Jahan between 1936 and 67. And they all stopped in 1611 when she marries the emperor. The very moment when her life's best work began. Then how to think about that afternoon in Dehradun in North India when my mother first told me about Nur Jahan. My girlhood was filled with her stories. I was 7 or 8. It was a hot summer afternoon. She and I were playing Gengitta, a bit like the American game of jacks, focused on our dice and the ball. But I grew bored and asked for a new story. I can't remember whether we finished the game, but she did tell me a story, one that I hadn't heard before, about Nur Jahan. My mother called her Maharani, Queen of Queens in Hindi. Still vivid are the glint in my mother's eye as she spoke, and the spark ignited in me by Noor's accomplishment and allure. So how to think of that moment? I begin the book with that moment. Its palimpsest effect on my life's work as Mughal historian and on the biography of Nur Jahan. The most useful thing about legends, as I thought about them, is what they reveal about the cultural and political forces that make them necessary or influence the details. Though not entirely factual, these legends and others are fact adjacent. They tell us about what people believed, what persisted, and what people thought about the role and character of women. A very important thing in doing public scholarship work. At the very least, they tell us what men and women thought about a remarkable 17th century woman. And finally, two questions that came up again and again each time I spoke. How did she do it? I'm asked each time I give a talk. The same query that was familiar 4 centuries ago, the same sense of puzzlement at a woman's supremacy. And the question, I think, is, and there's an after story to this book linked in this question, how did it happen back then and in India? I just want to say to you, and I can take this up in the question, this history, Mughal history, is being wiped out 350 years of this history is being wiped out, has been, for all intent and purposes, wiped out from several states in India, from the textbooks in several states in India under the charge of the Hindu right-wing regime. And I can talk more about that later on. It'll just completely take me away from what I'm doing, but it's something I've been engaged with since the book came out. So these contexts are not a backdrop in this book, something to understand the subject with, but context really plays on the narrative itself, history itself. Let me just elaborate with a couple of instances from the book. She was born the daughter of a Persian nobleman, as we've now heard several times, and was making his way in 1577 to India. She grows up in India, essentially the childhood. All we know is this one line, that she was born on the road in 1577 and she grows up in India. How to construct the childhood of this person, right? She's not a bolt from blue. How to construct the different segments of her life that made her who she is. And childhood was certainly very, very critical in that. There are no sources for it, but there are sources for it because we have architectural remains, the spaces within which she'll have grown, aristocratic mansions. We have books of comportment and training from that world, which all the aristocratic girls and boys read. So those became the sources. That's a chapter actually a lot of people come on to, because it's a palpable thing to connect different generations. Likewise, her first marriage, 10 years. She was married to this man and went to live in a place which was unlike any other, which was like the Wild West of India at that time, the state of Bengal, the land of the Bengal tiger. So where did she pick up the gun? Where did she master this amazing art of sovereignty, right? So those are things I had to take into account. In other words, very quickly thinking history and biography, not with a capital B and H, but history and biography with a small h and B. I just want to mention this very, very quickly. This is held in Rampur Raza Library in North India. And, it's a well-established painting of Nur Jahan. It's about this much in size, like typical miniature paintings. Portraiture skills had become very important in the atelier of her husband, who was a massive connoisseur of painting. He's a deeply lovely, philosophical, moody guy. I had to literally hold him back in writing this biography. This was well known to art historians, and they had established that the painting was made somewhere between 1612 and 17. It is made by the painter laureate, the finest, the most experimental portrait maker, a man called Abul Hassan. And quite unprecedentedly, his name is right there, which is not the convention of Mughal miniatures. So we knew all this. Art historians had done the work for me. I was talking to Walter Melian, I'm sure you know him, in the art history department, and we were looking at this painting. And he said to me, Ruby, there's something really unusual in this painting. So I said, what is that? He said, no, you tell me. I said, she's holding a musket. And he kept looking at me and he kept saying, I have never come across anything like that in European royal women's painting. She's holding the musket. Not only is she holding the musket, actually, I kept saying, he told me she's loading the musket, which actually tells you about technical know-how. So it's quite unprecedented painting. What would I do with something like this? The man who painted her, he was given the honorific Nadiru Zaman, wonder of the age. And he broke from his entire oeuvre of painting to make this. And he never painted something like this again. So I began to imagine a chapter, it's called Wonder of the Ages. I began to think, who is the wonder of the age here, right? And what was going through in his mind when he was, deciding to make this painting. So this is just a small demonstration. This is just by way of information. This is one of the edicts from the 1620. These are royal edicts, and so it's all usually it's a rose petal stamp, which was very distinctive. Somewhere here wiped out, but it's here. Is her name. The name is really interesting. Nur Jahan Pacha Begum. This is what I mean by going between the lines, but it's not just an easy exercise of going between the lines. 10 of these orders survive. So there was a bullet point history going on. She was very powerful. She issued coins in her name. There were imperial orders. So I began to read these imperial orders. And I come across the title Nur Jahan Pacha Begum. Nur Jahan, her name. Pacha, king. Begum, the lady. So lady emperor, in effect. So these are just some of the. I want to dwell on this painting for a little bit. I think you'll recall when I was talking about biography, I said at the end of the biography classic modes, kill the emperor, or kill a subject, or kill the empress. Well, I did not kill Nur Jahan. And by that I mean it's a political act. She was already killed in historical imagination. So where did I end the book? I ended the book with this painting. It's held in the Cleveland Museum of Art, and it's dated 1627. And in this painting, she holds the emperor's image. Let me just reflect on this a little bit. The last chapter of my book is called Beyond 1627. In a picture likely painted by the brilliant Bishan Das, another court painter, dated 1627, Nur Jahan stands holding a portrait of Jahangir. Standing tall against a forest green backdrop, she wears a tunic made of the prized diaphanous muslin that she likely invented. She was also a great dress designer. Over stylish striped pants, dark sandalwood paste scents the armpits, and tendrils of wavy hair fall loose at her back. The painter knew the Indian and Persian literary and painterly tradition of depicting women with men, or women holding portraits of men. Examples, not here, but just giving you examples. A wife gazes at a portrait of her husband, a princess observes a portrait of herself or someone else, a lone heroine draws a portrait of her lover or an absent husband. So in a Mughal portrait, this one, aside from this one, I mean, now in the Musée Quimé in Paris, a youngish Jahangir, her husband, tenderly holds a portrait of his father, Akbar the Great. What is holding? What is the meaning of the word holding? Owning, enjoying, viewing, feeling, embracing, continuing, extending. So, in keeping with this politics of asking questions, let me turn to this painting just for a second, and then we'll come back to the two are related, or in art historical terms, they are related. This painting right here was, so to make the long story short, Akbar wasn't terribly happy that Jahangir was going to ascend the throne. It often happened. There was no law of primogeniture, so that the oldest succeeded the throne. So there was this horrible, nasty nonsense that went on towards the end. But in the end, he became the emperor. And he had this painting cast almost as a sign of forgiveness. Not Akbar, but Jahangir had this painting cast. And what's really quite interesting in this painting is this globe, the nimbus, this orb, these are all signs of sovereignty. But it's king to king. It's extending. It's parting royalty, parting sovereignty from one generation to another. So the orb, the postures, the nimbus, this means that Jahangir was sharing his father's spiritual power, and hence he was a legitimate successor to the sovereign power. I want to reflect on one more thing. Nur holding Jahangir's image. Just notice one small thing. She not only holds the Empress image, she looks intimately at it. One of the most powerful invocations of observing an image, reflection of the self as the viewer gazes, comes from the well-known allegory, Persian allegory, which was hugely popular in this entire world of kings in the, let's say, the Islamic world, which was philosophically charted by a man called Nizami, who was a 12th century philosopher and writer and allegorist. In this allegory, he says that there was a painter, a man called Shapur, who was highly skilled at lifelike presentations. And this painter tells a prince at that time, so this is an allegory, but related. He tells a prince at that time, a man called Khusro, that there was a woman called Shireen, literally a beautiful woman, and that the prince should meet this beautiful woman. Now, the prince had also heard from his grandfather that there was this amazing woman of great sweetness. There's a play on the word Shireen, which literally means sweet. And so the Prince Khusro asks the painter Shapur to find Shireen, but he must do so through a portrait. Shapur, disguised as a monk, goes to Armenia to find Shireen. He finds out from a priest where she and her attendants spent the time. Early morning, he goes to that meadow, paints a portrait of the Prince Khusro, and suspends it on a branch of a tree. Shireen and her companions arrive. Her eyes fall upon the portrait. The women bring the portrait to her, and looking at her, she becomes absorbed, in quotes, in rapt contemplation. She embraces it as if it were alive. Thinking that the portrait was the work of demonic creatures, the women take it away from her. The next day, the painter makes a second painting exactly like the first. When Shireen sees it, she gets overwhelmed, unable to speak. The women destroy the painting again, burn rue to dispel evil spirits, and move to a new meadow. And so the painter Shapur embarks on a third one, exactly like the first two. And here's what the philosopher Nizami is saying. In the mirror, Aina, that is the mirror of the painting, she saw her own reflection when she seized it, and she fainted. The intensity of Shireen's emotion is best captured in Nizami's own emphasis that the portrait she held, again I'm quoting from him, contained her own reflection. Nur Jahan and Jahangir were linked in name. Nur meaning light. Jahangir, upon accession in 1605, he was called Prince Salim before, had named himself Nuruddin Jahangir, that is light of the faith, Caesar of the world. In 1611, at the time of their wedding, he honored his last wife, Mehrun Nisa, that was her birth name, son of women, S-U-N, and called her Nur Mahal, light of the palace. He went further in 1616 and announced and recorded so in his memoir that everyone was to address her as Nur Jahan, light of the world, the name by which posterity remembers her. Now, light is not just a metaphor. The intermingling of imperial and sacred spaces in the sovereign's role, in which the most lofty ambition of a ruler was to be legitimized as the monarch of two worlds, the visible and the spiritual, was very much part of this kingship. In the person of the emperor rested divine order and harmony. The idea of divine light was borrowed from Persian and Neoplatonic philosophy that argued that all life was given existence by the constant blinding illumination of the light of lights or God. All men possessed a divine spark, but only the highest were the masters of the age. The emperor and the empress were such a couple. So, following on this inheritance of this illuminist theory of sovereignty, in which monarch was the shadow of God, Nur or light was now used to give a different twist to the dissemination of the new imperial vision by Nur and Jahangir. Coins with stellar associations of fortune and light came to be called Nur Shahi, light of sovereignty, Nur Sultani, light of kingship, Nur Daulat, light of court, Nur Mihir, light of the sun, Nur, 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 light, light, light. So Jahangir holds his father's image, father to son, ruler to ruler. Nur Jahan holds a husband's portrait, a visual mark of the imperial couple in conversation with each other. Jahangir holds his father's image, she holds her husband's image. Who else but Jahangir's beloved co-sovereign would hold his portrait? Love and light, the shared sovereignty was the link. Just as Jahangir was celebrated holding his father's image, so was he shown here again, only this time alongside Nur Jahan. The power of the portrait, of this portrait and any portrait, is immense. The splendor of such works of art lies precisely in their potential of telling many stories from many points of view. In Nur Jahan holding a portrait of Emperor Jahangir, the painter, through his unique skills in portraiture, seems to meditate on Nur Jahan's unique achievements. The portrait may even be seen as a visual mark of the imperial couple in conversation with each other about their beloved Mughal India. There could even be an argument about whose Mughal world it was. The portrait is one more step, one more small thing in this journey that I've shared with you, reflecting on the unique figure